speak for them in addition to your own entity. And everything that happens in this room is fully shareable outside of it too. And that's a good reminder that this is being recorded and posted. So if you need to eat or do something, don't hesitate to turn your video off. That's a-okay. And then optimize for deciding and acting. And then an additional ground rule is no deliberation outside of the meeting, as we had some of that happening by email a few weeks ago. So and appreciated the heads up on that. And then before we move into, we had a motion to postpone our discussion from last week. Before we move into that, I wanted just a real quick point of clarification. The FTE value for our contracts is sort of broken out into three components. There's an attorney component, there's a staff component, and then there's an overhead component. And so part of our reasoning for wanting to have a definition for staff is so that when we start to allocate funding specifically for staff, we know what that's for, as opposed to overhead. And so probably where the question really comes up about this is probably going to be around what's excluded from staff. So is a phone service considered staff? It doesn't mean that it's going to be excluded from the contract and there will be no funding for it. It just means, is that exclusion going to put it into the overhead bucket, or will it stay in the staff component of the FTE? So that's just some clarification there to sort of maybe guide the discussion a little bit about whether a phone service should be considered staff or overhead. And then that leads to questions probably like, should Kinkos be considered staff or overhead if we're providing a service and those sorts of things. So just to sort of bear that in mind as we go forward, we have we called it a motion to table, but according to the Roberts Rules of Orders, that means a motion to table means that it kills a motion. So I'm going to assume that we wanted to postpone. A motion to postpone says we will simply delay a vote and can reopen debate. So I'm going to assume that what was proposed was a motion to postpone, and we are going to reopen the debate on and the discussion on the previous motion. And what I'll do, Elena has that available on Word. You all have that. Until we actually start modifying it or doing anything, I'll just open back up the debate on that. Any further thoughts? And also Olcott provided some additional guidance that I sent out as well, and as part of the agenda.
I'll just note that I liked what Olcott suggested in his third suggestion, which is staff or persons who provide support for attorneys through administrative, clerical, communicative, technical, or similar work.
Any discussion on that?
Just to let people know, hopefully you can hear me. That was an attempt to rewrite what we had used last week or 2 weeks ago, and how well it worked. That's where I started, and I went simplifying it from there. And so, back on your comment, Billy, about the three buckets, I would, and as it relates to phone services more than anything, I think we need to keep what is in one bucket the same for everyone.
Right.
Whereas if I use a phone service, as opposed to Autumn uses a actual person who's an employee to answer the phone, those are really the same function and they ought to be treated the same way.
So Olcott, real quick, you had proposed this initially, this motion. We're okay with the amendments that we made to it in the last meeting. And now is there this third definition, which Autumn has said she agrees with. is that something you want to provide a new motion for, or what are your thoughts there?
And I think it's better to have, I mean, if everybody's sort of coalescing around a particular definition, then I would absolutely say yes, amend what is currently on the table to that definition. That's part of the reason I had those 3 separate ones, is happy to go with whatever the group feels the best.
Any discussion on that?
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Brooke.
Hi, would this cover an independent contractor? Because in the definition that was just on the screen, it's hard for me to understand whether that would cover a phone answering service or somebody I hire to do tech support 5 hours a week, or only people who are actually employees.
My thought all along is it would cover the independent contractors that are hired specifically for things that support attorneys. Like the tech person, if they're an independent contractor, which probably most of us have somebody like, if we have somebody, it's an independent contractor. Certainly phone answering services. It's not meant to be people that are necessarily employees.
Okay, I guess my only comment about that then is I'm not sure how much direction or supervision you can give someone if they're an independent contractor as opposed to just the scope of a job. So that's my only concern about that. I like the overall working definition.
I agree with you, Brooke, that is a labor law question, and ultimately, I don't think that necessarily gets into the definition. It certainly gets into how all of us, as somebody who's hiring somebody, either as an independent contractor or as an employee, deals with the labor law issues. I think, yes, you can do that with an independent contractor, with an IT person and with a phone answering service, but somebody who's going to be doing what we think of as a administrative assistant or a legal assistant or something like that, I'm not sure those people can be anything but employees. But I don't think we need to, as a definitional thing, go into that weed.
Would Kinko's fall underneath this? I'm trying to just think of like vulnerabilities and risks as well. You know, a copying service, or, you know, someone that maybe has a lot of documents that they copy. I don't know if that's a great example anymore, but you kind of know what I'm saying. Like, how far can we take this?
Maybe you're thinking more along the lines of something like a shredding service, which I think some of us may actually use. I don't even know if anyone uses. Is Kinko still around anymore? I don't know.
A service.
Yeah.
Telegraph.
I don't think so. And I think that would be such a stretch that even really creative attorneys would have a hard time with it. I'm just guessing.
Yeah, this is Mark. I would say a shredding service would be more of an operational or overhead expense, not staff level.
John, you have your hand up.
Well, yeah, I would agree that, you know, when you get into starting to talk about IT services, I mean, unless you pay to have somebody on your staff, I mean, you know, they probably come in and do the job just like a copier service or a shredding service would do. So that's, you know, I think the IT, if you had someone on site, yeah, but otherwise, if you just have somebody comes in and says like, my computer's not working, fix it. So, you know, I think there are things like shredding or copying services that would be just necessarily excluded, and not that it really comes up that much, probably.
Autumn, you have a hand up?
Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of asked this question last time because I was trying to understand what an answering service is in better terms. Because I think I've run into them when I've tried to reach other attorneys on shared client cases. And frankly, been frustrated with the inability to actually get information about a case. I don't know whether that's what the kind of service that everybody has. But if I'm to assume that all the person does is take a message, write it down, give it to the attorney, and can't actually provide any information about, hey, when's my next court date, or when will the attorney be available, or things like that, I do think it is pretty different than an actual staff person that can provide that sort of information. But I say that with a like very low level of knowledge of what an answering service actually does. So, you know, I'm free to be corrected. And I know I'm taking a little bit of a contrary position to what other people are saying here, but I'm just doing it without the knowledge of what kind of great service the answering service provides, just based upon what I've actually experienced on the receiving end of those.
Yeah. Rebecca, you have your hand up?
Yeah, so just to start with Autumn's response, what I don't think an answering service is great particularly when compared to, you know, in office staff. But I know that particularly for some of the newer lawyers who are just getting started, that's an option that makes sense for them. And it's a real body answering the phone that can, if you've got a client who's saying, this is an emergency, right? Like they have ways to get a hold of people. So I do think an answering service, I mean, and you're paying for that. So I think an answering service should be included. I also think, for example, some firms and some places have social workers that are on staff that like do home visits and things like that. And I think that should be included. And I think it is included under this definition that's up on the screen right now. So that's my 2 cents worth.
John?
Sorry, I was muted. Are social workers included as staff? I mean,
We have,
it seems to me they're more like investigators.
yeah, we have excluded them from this definition in the same way we have investigators, because we already have contracts and definitions for them. Yeah.
So most of what I've heard people say with regard to answering services have been that they're not taking the place of an actual staff person. They're being used pretty sparingly, it sounds like. And I think maybe, I don't know if Michelle is here, but she seemed to be like the person that maybe was using it the most. So my question is, how much of an FTE do you suspect you're using or your membership is using for an answering service? Because that really is the question. Is that answering service then overhead? Is that answering service considered staff? Because the reason, as Billy mentioned earlier on, back to those kind of three buckets of funding, is which bucket does that answering service fall under?
Mark, you have your, I think Mark or Brooke, I didn't see which one had their hand up first. Go ahead, Mark.
Okay, so I think I would say that an answering service would comprise of a part of an FTE. I mean, I certainly wouldn't classify them as like a full-time FTE, but I think one thing you need to understand is that, at least here in Columbia County, is that if you're receiving calls from the jail and you don't actually pick up the phone, that person cannot get a hold of you or leave a message. And so it's really important, because you may have like a part-time staff person who's here at the office, but they may work, you know, part of the week or some of the week, but then you need to have maybe coverage for the full day, especially if you're in court. And so that's the phone service, I think, can complement staff level, and I personally think it should count as, I mean, whether you're hiring someone to sit there and answer the phones or individually, or contracting the service to do that, I see it as the same function. I see that way different than a shredding service. So even if, I understand that maybe they don't provide all the detailed information that someone that could be in the office could identify, but I do think that it should count as some part of FTE, and it certainly supplements a practice, especially if you only have part-time staff that can't be there the full time. So.
Thank you, Mark. Brooke?
I have 2 points to make. First, on the answering service, I guess I don't conceptually have a problem with an answering service as part of an FTE if OPDS is really thinking about making it close to a 1-to-1 ratio of support staff to attorney. But if it's going to be a 0.5 ratio, having the answering service chew up part of that 0.5 FTE seems like you're cutting it a little tight, particularly by its very definition. An answering service can't answer client questions. They can't actually help the client anything more than take a message. So unless I'm misunderstanding what an answering service is or what they do, and maybe we need Michelle's input for this since she was an advocate for it, I'd be reluctant to have it included if you're only thinking about a 0.5 FTE requirement for the ratio. My other point is a question regarding social workers. I had Reed fill in for me 2 weeks ago, so maybe I missed this part of the discussion, but it seems to me that social workers should be included in the definition of staff because some firms use social workers interchangeably with either legal assistants or paralegals to get that similar sort of work done, perhaps at a little higher ability level depending on the individual. I understand why investigators aren't included because you're definitionally excluding them and you have a different way of budgeting for and dealing with investigation. But it seems to me that social workers should be a part of that. And I'd be very curious about the logic about why we exclude them and how that would impact firms who are using a hybrid model.
Yeah, the PCRP is sort of what we're modeling that on. So the under the PCRP, all of the social workers are either under a sole proprietor contract and or an employee, typically of a PD office, is where they're trying that in a couple of counties, and or in Multnomah maybe only, Caroline.
And actually Douglas.
And Douglas.
Yeah.
So since PCRP is, the intent is to roll that out statewide, we would continue on with that as far as capturing them underneath a either their own individual contract or they would be an employee of a contractor, and really to provide that consistency across the state for the practice. So we have a couple of managers that's all they do is they just manage that consistency of practice and the quality of that practice, that social work practice across the state in all the PCRP counties. And we're talking about even in non-PCRP counties, even in discussion right now about that very thing. So if there's a social worker that's working in a non-PCRP county, we want to make sure that they're working with Dana Bradley, who's the social worker Dana Brandon for the social worker as a social worker sort of manager / supervisor to maintain that consistency of quality.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. That's all correct. We recognize that some firms may currently have staff that have a skill set that's more similar to a social worker, but it is a unique skill set. And I think we're really trying to, separate those skill sets. And as Billy said, the case manager social worker is either under a separate contract or is, if it's an employee of a current firm or a PD office, that, they likely would have their own contract, separate funding. We feel like staff is a much more, it's a much more specialized skill set, or actually the case manager is a much more specialized skill set. But that may be what you're referring to, Brooke, is that some staff can do some, and I think there's, I think that probably varies widely across the state.
Brooke, did you want to respond to that? You still have your hand up.
Actually, those explanations take away my misgivings about that. If you're separately tracking that and have a way to maybe provide a separate contract process for firms that have a social worker and have then supervision through your social worker outreach coordinator. I'm sorry, I'm describing that wrong. I would withdraw my objection. I think that makes sense to exclude them then from this category.
And then, Jack, I want to get to you in just a minute. I wanted to add that the dictionary definition of staff is all the people employed by a particular organization. So maybe employment might come into this conversation too. Jack?
Yeah, the whole social worker thing, it seems to me it's tied in pretty strongly to the size of the organization. I mean, the smaller you are, the more varied people have to be, and you do a little bit of everything. I'm the office head, and I'm still the one that unplugs the toilet when it gets clogged, right? But the question I had was with respect to the answering stuff. I understand how an answering service works. What I have no idea of is what they cost, and that seems like it should be part of the discussion. If we're seriously thinking about allocating part of an FTE to an answering service, well, do they cost the same as an employee? I have no idea.
Anyone have a guidance on that, Mark?
Typically, at least the phone service that I have used, it's about $1,200 a month. And they charge by the minute of the calls that they get.
How many attorneys do you have?
2. But I also use that to answer, to help capture calls that are coming from clients that are coming into the contract as well. So I just want to make sure it's a way to make sure that even if someone's gone on vacation or sick, that that call is getting answered and then routed to the person that needs to answer it. So, whether they're classified as staff or not, I think, I don't know, but I mean, it's certainly a cost that I think that can be necessary in certain circumstances.
I don't have any real strong feelings about the issue, honestly, but it does seem like it's a little bit of a stretch to me to call an answering service staff, but I'll just leave it at that.
It does seem like there would be a bit of vulnerability based on that, on the dollar amounts there, because staff would probably be significantly more. And so that would be, someone could have quite a bit of an answering service versus an employee and, pocket the difference, so to speak. And, we're not really getting what we're paying for necessarily, to think about it along those lines. Whereas if it were part of overhead, that would seem reasonable in that instance. Those are just my thoughts. Brooke, I see your hand still up. Is that, you still have a question or?
Unintentional, I'll lower it, thanks.
Okay, Autumn, I see your hand went up.
Yeah,
then-
as we were talking about this, it made me think about an possible edit to the definition that I do still like, which is the third definition that Olcott suggested, which was maybe saying the staff or persons who provide support for attorneys and clients, or adding that to any definition that we have. And I think that that's probably somewhat important that is something that is a part of it. Feel free to tell me that that there's different opinions, but I do think that some mention of clients might be useful here.
Bruce, you had your hand up next. Thank you, Autumn.
Bruce, you're muted.
Bruce, you're on mute.
I've not used an answering service, but my one thought with respect to that is, and I've considered it because we often get about 1,000 calls a month, and that clogs up my 2 assistants' time considerably and my time. I don't see it answering service as a replacement for staff, but I see it as a supplement to staff, and it would allow, if I used an answering service, it would allow me to pay my staff fairly and save some cost in another area. And it probably gets me a better answering service than I would normally be willing to spend for. I mean, I think if I'm just having someone answer the phone and take messages and connect them with the attorneys, that's a pretty basic job that I could train a college student or a high school student to do effectively. And if I could reduce the cost by hiring an answering service who can get the information to the appropriate people, that allows me to pay my staff better and keep their work moving along. So maybe it's a staff supplement, or it's, you know, an adjunct to staff, I guess.
John, you have your hand up, and then Olcott next.
Well, I just have a comment on Autumn's comment about adding in support for attorneys and clients, but you know, and I think we've all had this experience where we've had having a very demanding client call up my legal assistant and then, you know, order the legal assistant to do a bunch of things that I wouldn't have the legal assistant do. So I mean we have to remember who staff is working for. The attorney, while we are working for our clients, our staff are working for us or the organization, not the client. And so I don't want to have any ambiguity. I don't think we should have any ambiguity there. I mean, I think it's different if you have a social worker, because a social worker is doing things, or the investigator sometimes is doing things directly for the client, but it has to be done, you know, at the direction of the attorney.
Thank you, John. Cott?
Thank you. I sort of come on the other side of Autumn's comment about clients. I like that in there because it reminds us that that's what we're doing this for, is for our clients. And I fortunately, I guess, have not had a client who's called up my staff and told them that they need to do A, B, C, or D. And I certainly would, you know, remember to tell my staff if my client does that, check with me to make sure that I really want you to do A, B, C, or D, because you really work for me as an employee, not the client. But I like the word "and clients" in there because it reminds us, and I think it's good to remind us of who we're really doing this for. And then secondly, if we want to limit this to employees, then I think it's easy. It's using my third definition, staff or employees who provide support and so forth. So my comments. Thank you.
Bruce, you still have your hand up. Is that intentional or okay? So Cott, am I hearing then an amendment to your original motion, or where do we stand with the definition that we have right now?
I would unmute myself first and talk about, and is what Autumn's described as my third definition. Make the definition staff or persons who provide support for attorneys and clients through administrative, clerical, communicative, technical, or similar work. And I dropped off under the supervision of an attorney because of your comment when we last met, Billy, that at least in the past, maybe in the present, there's been a provider that wasn't run by an attorney, which is fine, but certainly I would expect that, and I'm guessing it would be an office rather than a consortia. The non-attorney provider is really the person that directs the people we call staff, legal assistants and all of that, or certainly can, and deals with the data stuff and all that. And so we can't limit it to attorneys, because otherwise all those folks would be working and they wouldn't count. That's why I dropped off at the direction of an attorney.
Can you read that again, Cott?
Staff are persons who provide support for attorneys and clients through administrative, clerical, communicative, technical, or similar work.
You should be able to see that on your screen now in that second paragraph.
I can.
Yeah, I'm just calling. I'm calling in Billy, so I don't.
Oh,
have the
gotcha,
screen
yeah.
Today.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. Yep.
So, my 2 cents would be, since I'm off mute for a second here, if I can. I don't think we want to make this overly complicated. I think we get a dozen attorneys and we sit and we go back and forth. I think we got to keep in mind, and I think we're getting simpler, I think. But we've got big firms in the valley. We've got very, very small firms at the coast on the east side of the mountains, and kind of a one size fits all definition is tough to do. I would encourage, I know we've talked about what is going to be the staff ratio. I would be hard pressed to recommend anything over 0.5 per attorney. I know there are some that have more than that, but the 0.5 attorney, I think, is as high as we would want to go as a minimum. And I think as far as answering service, I mean, we could talk about that till we're blue in the face. And maybe we just say 0.5 minimum, and a 0.1 of that could be answering service. That would then, obviously you'd have to have somebody in the office at least some of the time. But there's a lot of one attorney firms in consortiums that frankly don't have one and one. And I think some of them would almost put out of business, to be quite honest, unless OPDS is going to start paying substantially more, which I don't see that happening. So these kind of unfunded mandates that we would get from this definition and then the requirement, I think, would be problematic for a lot of small firms. And so I would encourage us all to not go any higher than 0.5 ratio for attorneys. And I think the definition is fine. I think one of my concerns was, I think there's a lot of small firms, one attorney firms. Some guy might have, or some woman may have their husband or come in and work part-time, or a man may have his wife work part-time, where they don't even pay them. They just come in the office and work 3 hours a day, 3 days a week or whatever. I think that happens more often than we think it does in these small offices around the state that provide engine defense work. So I think that's also got to be kept in mind. So anyway, that's all I have.
Thank you, Chris. And I think it also, quality assurance is going to be a big piece of what we're doing, has been, and will continue to grow going forward. And so it's, this is for a contract that is for a period of time. And if we find that there are instances where that's, an answering service is being abused as opposed to being a supplemental help, then, that's something that we would direct on a more individual basis. And if we see a widespread sort of concern with that, then we would revisit the definition potentially, I suppose. I'm just thinking through from an agency perspective. Bruce, you have your hand up?
Yeah, getting to, I think it was Chris's comments. I think probably occasionally any number of attorneys have people from their families or whatever coming in and doing work on a volunteer basis. I mean, I think the whole point of this new funding model and how we're approaching it is to get away from that. I mean,
Right.
As much as I love my wife and family, and frankly, look, I've had my kids come in and clean the office here and paid them. Ideally, we would be getting enough funds not to do that. So that's why I think it's important to have, I guess, answering services and things like that take into account all those different sizes of providers.
Yeah, point well taken. Thank you.
Billy, one quick comment. This is Chris again.
Yeah.
I apologize for not being on. Yeah, and I don't disagree with that. I guess my concern is we're going to be told OPDS is going to mandate something, and they're not going to increase. The funding part is going to come 3 or 4 or 5 years later. Yet now we're going to have to do this type of have staff. X number of staff people, can't be family, can't be this, can't be that. I agree. I mean, it'd be great if we were funded to a level where we could go out and get 1-to-1 or a 0.6 or 0.75, whatever. But if the money's not there, for a lot of people, it's very difficult. And I just don't have any confidence. My concern is OPDS is going to mandate it and there's going to be no increase.
Well, the budget piece of this is definitely going to be coming next, and anything that's going to increase the budget for us going forward will definitely have to wait until we have the funding for it. But we don't want the budget to drive the policy. We're trying to have the policy drive the budget. That's really what our intent and goal is here. But I understand what you're saying for sure. Is there anyone else on the phone? It's because there's no hand raising on the phones necessarily. Is there anyone else on the phone just before we move it to a motion or anything that has a comment? So I heard Pat, I heard you. I'm going to assume this is a motion. I'm going to understand that it's a motion. Is there a second on that? On the definition on the screen?
I'll second it.
Okay. And so we just need a vote. Any further discussion before we go to a vote? All right. I'm going to call the roll. I guess that's appropriate. Autumn?
Aye.
Brooke?
Aye.
Bruce?
Aye.
Jack?
I'm going to abstain.
John?
Nay.
And I'm sorry, that was John Sarr. John Hamilton?
You're on mute.
Okay. Chris?
Nay.
Mark?
Aye.
Michelle, I do not know if Michelle's here. Okay, so she's not here. Cott?
Aye.
Rebecca?
Aye.
And either Todd McCann or Tracy Gregg. I didn't see which one of you were here today.
Todd is here, and I'm going to abstain too.
Okay. So we had, so the ayes carry it. We had, we'll provide those numbers later in the minutes. I'd like to move on to the drafting of start with the drafting for the staff attorney ratio. And rather than, we've had a lot of discussion about this already, and even just a little bit today as we were talking about the staff definition. There seemed to be a consensus, and even as Chris was talking today a little bit about it, that the ratio should be that a minimum should be 0.5 FTE staff, and then but a cap of 1 FTE, no more than a 1-to-1 ratio for staff. That's sort of the consensus I've been hearing through the discussion over the last couple of weeks. So I don't know if anybody has a motion along those lines, or if we want to open it for discussion first. Scott?
Given and this is partly going off of Chris's comments, given the current financial realities, I think we should start mandating what it is now, 0.5. And we should say that we should move to a 1-to-1 ratio as funding's available or something like that. I think that should be the goal, but that's that budget part that isn't there at this point.
Okay. Are you making a motion, or are you discussing?
I was just discussing at this point.
Gotcha. Autumn, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I was just looking at the research stuff, and it looks like you guys, I think you added a whole spreadsheet to this group of research, which includes what the staff to attorney ratio is for all of the different offices that you have contracts with. And there's a very wide variety. And so I'm just wondering, you know, for the ones that have a more than 1-to-1 ratio right now, is there some explanation for how they're so much, because some of them are like 2, some of them are like 1 point something. I thought I saw one that was 3. Anyway, I just was kind of curious because some of them seem like sole proprietorships and maybe they have those people doing work on non-public defense cases or something. I'm just wondering how we interpret this data in order to put a cap and how that works in with this definition.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Appreciate that. The one that really stands out is Diana Bettles in Klamath County, which is 3.4 to 1. And she is tasked with something in addition to what she would normally do with just her practice. She's also tasked with scheduling and assigning attorneys for arraignment because we have 16 sole proprietor contracts in Klamath County. And so that's a big part of that. So she has that staff that is there for arraignment for all 16 of those attorneys under single contracts is part of her sort of staff, so to speak, like she's running that piece of it. So that's probably not what we're suggesting. That would be something that would be an additional line item to pay for that because it's something outside of her current law practice. It's actually in support of the county's allocation of caseload.
So our ratio, Jeff, our ratio somehow has like a good cause finding associated with it, unless good cause for otherwise.
Right. And then Jeff Hedlund is another one that stands out. He's in Lake County and is kind of doing something similar to that, but also then working stuff in Klamath County. So some of these are just, they're kind of one-offs a little bit. Again, this is the just cause, so to speak. And then probably the other ones that are like 1.1, I'm trying to just kind of look down through here. Most of these are sole proprietor and they're either in remote areas. That's probably where most of them are. I'm looking at like Josh Guest, also in Klamath, and Jennifer also in Klamath. So I think there's certainly some of these that are. David Carlson is another one where there's just a lot of travel, and Curry County probably another one, 1.3. Again, that consortium is, there's just enough attorneys there that they're having to do some administrative stuff as well, but they don't have a line item in their contract for it. So they've captured it that way. There's no additional funding for the 1.3 necessarily.
Okay. Thanks.
What we were hearing, the consensus, I know that was pretty general. The consensus was we were talking about 0.5, and you'll see that most of these are anywhere between 0.5 and 1 for most of them. But we heard from a number of juvenile providers that that ratio needs to be higher. Then what do you do if you handle both of those case types within a particular contract? Jack, you have your hand up?
Yeah. So when we're talking about the staff ratio, I agree that 0.5 I think is a good idea. Are we trying to set a minimum and a maximum? And if we are, is there really a need for a maximum?
That's a good question. That was just kind of the consensus of the group. Two things kind of happening. The consensus of the group was 0.5 seemed like a reasonable minimum, but then others were saying, we need more because we handle juvenile caseload. And we also heard from people that contractors that were saying we have a lot of travel. And so we need some additional staff for that. And that's also actually in the literature, also called that out too as a reason for more staff. In addition to that, we also have this breakdown by contract and entity type where nobody has 0.5 to 1 staff. Everybody has more. So how do we, if that seems reasonable for pretty much all contractors, then we want to make sure that we're funding that and that we're doing something that's meaningful and purposeful along those lines.
Well, I think it is important to have a minimum, and I agree with what Chris said, that 0.5 should be it, because there are attorneys who are going to work without staff because they think they can. That's been a constant battle in my firm. I disagree with the idea that a one-to-one staff should necessarily be a goal. I think there are a lot of sole practitioners who simply would not know what to do with a full-time employee and would very likely not ever be able to figure it out. You know, I once again, this is going to sound like a tired theme, but I think flexibility is the key.
So thank you, Jack. Mark, you had your hand up next, and then Cott. You're on mute.
I agree with the idea that there should be a minimum of 0.5. I would disagree with the idea of setting a cap at this point. I think what probably would make more sense is that if someone has a project or is providing a service, they could, I think, as part of their contract, ask that more staff be funded and make a justification for that, and do it that way versus setting some type of arbitrary limit that the maximum is 1-to-1. I mean, I think the idea is to at least have the providers use staff, and then if it may make sense to have, instead of having a, you know, one box fits all, and to make it so that if there is a need for additional staff, like if there's significant travel or something like that, then they can put in a justification for that in their project.
Yeah. Cott, you were next. Thank you, Mark.
Few comments. My understanding is that going forward, and I'm not including the very likely, probable, required, whatever, 6-month extension to June of 2022. But my understanding going forward is that OPDS will not be giving an entity a combination of adult and juvenile contract.
Great point. Great point.
And I think we need, based on the comments, that maybe the ratio should be different for juvenile folks. I think we should maybe adopt 2 different ratios. The other part is for particularly Klamath County, that extra, if you will, using that as an example anyway, that extra, if you will, administrative work should be done through a separate contract, because that's not really attorney work as everybody else is doing. So I would move for adult criminal representation that a minimum of 0.5-to-1 staff to attorney ratio be required, and that we move towards a greater staff to attorney ratio as funding is provided. I frankly don't have any idea what the ratio should be for juvenile. Thanks.
What is the, Caroline, point of just information, what is the ratio right now for PCRP?
Yeah, so we require, on the PCRP side, we require 0.5, but we will pay up to full time if they do have a 1-to-1. But we're not paying more ratio. And we actually have heard, I mean, I hear you saying that maybe it takes more on juvenile, and that may be, but we actually have, we've heard from quite a few juvenile providers under PCRP that they don't have enough work for full-time staff either. So I don't know that you do need a different standard. I think somewhere between 0.5 and 1 would probably work for most everybody.
Autumn, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I think that looking at the data and thinking about what everyone said, I totally agree that a 0.5 floor is appropriate. I guess I had the backup question of many of these offices, including my own office and other offices in Multnomah County, have slightly above that, which my understanding is right now that just comes out of the FTE for one attorney position. And so to the extent that the ratio we're gonna require and whatever goals that are set out of that are also indicative of the pay, I guess I just wanted to know how much our decision-making on this ratio indicates what the actual FTE payout is.
Yeah, and our intent is that it will absolutely impact the funding. So right now, the number of staff you have, the requirement is that it has to be 0.5 to 1. But if it's more than that, then that's either coming out of your pocket or you're just sort of, you know, spreading that a little thinner in order to accomplish it. But there's no additional funding for anything above 0.5. Whereas if we were to adopt a ratio, then we would provide funding for something in addition to 0.5. So if someone were at 0.6 or 0.7 or any iteration of that, it would just be an iteration of the value associated with staff as one component of the full value of the FTE.
So that we're already headed in that direction, or we would have to make a baseline of more than 0.5 in order to get to increase in pay to accomplish that?
We have to change the ratio. Yeah, we're not there right now. That would also require us, that also means we don't have the funding for that right now either. So that would be something that we would have to go to LFO. I mean, this is a recommendation to the commission, and at the point that the commission would adopt it, then that's something that we would then start to build into our budget in discussions with LFO.
Okay, thank you.
Jack, you still have your hand up?
Yeah, so this issue seemed like a relatively simple issue to me, at least until yesterday, until yesterday's meeting. And that, in my mind, raised so many issues that I'm not sure how we can even make a decision about this. I mean, for instance, they were talking yesterday, and you just mentioned it, about separate contracts for juvenile and adult. I can't even imagine really how that's going to work in our situation for firms that are doing both. And now we're kind of jumping into the idea of, well, maybe there should be a higher ratio for people that do juvenile folks. It seems to me that has the potential to exacerbate what I see as an issue, which is, you know, historically, we've always kind of hoped for, fought for, wished for parity with the prosecutors. And now the folks that are doing adult and juvenile are hoping that they have parity with the juvenile practitioners. And then, you know, we add different staffing requirements. That has the tendency to exacerbate that. And then the other question that I can't stop thinking about is this $100 million holdback. Is OPDS going to be contracting for $325 million or $225 million? I mean, this is a giant mess, if you ask me. So I don't know how we decide those things when we have all these other questions.
Your comments are well taken. There are.
That's an artful non-answer.
We have a lot of non-answers for all of your questions. Yes. So all of that is being built. We're working through the recommendations now, as you heard yesterday. But at the end of the day, what this ratio would do. So we're trying to set a policy, regardless of what the funding mechanism is, or whether the funding comes through or not, or whatever, with an intent of what is the best practice for a ratio. Once we establish that, then let's work on getting funding for it, right? If that means we need additional funding, and if the 100 million comes through or it doesn't, or they give us more, or we go hourly, or we go sole proprietor, or we go all state employees. I mean, all these things are out there, right? We have no idea. But at the end of the day, a ratio would still stand as a policy, and we just have to figure out the mechanism for funding that. Brooke, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I guess I'm confused, much like Jack indicated, confusion about where we're going next based on sort of some ambiguity from the contract call yesterday. But if we're trying to develop best practice, I can't really conclude from looking at that research that 0.5 staff per attorney is best practice. It seems like we're a lot closer to 0.75 overall when you look at the ratios everywhere except the coast. And that might be because of more sole practitioners. There might be reasons for that. But if we're talking about overall best practices, it's hard for me to not say it should be 0.75. If we were including investigators and social workers, I think it would actually be 1. But since we're not including that, I think 0.75 is a much better ratio. So a motion I would propose instead is OPDS shall require a minimum of 0.5 staff per attorney FTE and fund up to 0.75 staff per attorney as resources allow.
So we have 2 motions essentially. We have one from Cott and one from Brooke.
I second Brooks.
Who was that seconded? Was that Autumn? Yeah.
Yes, it was.
All right. So help me out, Robert's Rules of Orders experts. We have a motion with a second, and we have another motion on the table. Do we look? Cott, you have your hand up.
I withdraw my motion.
All right. All right, and we have a second on Brooks. Any discussion, Bruce?
Yeah, I guess I would be concerned about limiting it to 0.75. As I'm thinking back in time to when I worked at an office that appeared to be pretty well funded, and going through my head, each of the attorneys had a legal assistant. We had other staff, and that was caseload dependent. The caseloads were too high, but we were probably in excess of 1 per attorney. So I would just be concerned at limiting it to 0.75. It would seem that 1 would be an appropriate number.
Jack, your hand was up. I don't know if you intended for it to be up yet.
Yeah, I did. I think flexibility is important. I would agree with Brooke that 0.75 would be preferable to 1/2 in an organization his size. I don't think that that's necessarily the case with individual practitioners. The size of the provider, I think, makes a huge difference, and the rule shouldn't be one size fits all. So 0.75 for Lane County, sure. I can live with that. For some individual attorney who just doesn't need that much, I don't think so.
So point of clarification, the Brooks motion was 0.5 as a minimum, funded up to then through 0.75. So that may take care of your concern, but I don't know.
I'm sorry. I thought maybe I misunderstood him. I thought he was saying the minimum should be 0.75. Okay, I stand corrected then if that's not the case.
I see, Todd, you have your hand up. You're on mute.
Agree with Bruce, just the limit of the upper 0.75. I would like to have an upper limit, say, of 1, because taking a look at the number of the juvenile defender offices in here, we have a 0.9, we have a 0.8, we have a 0.7, 0.8. So it just seems limiting it to 0.75. Would rather not see that as an upper limit.
Thank you, Todd. And Todd, you had your hand up, and then Autumn next.
If my hand's up, it's a mistake. I apologize. I forgot to lower it.
Thanks, Scott. Autumn?
Yes, I understood, and I'm sure Brooke can probably clarify, his motion to not be that 0.75 would be the upper limit, but instead that would be the goal that we're funding up to in the contract. I think he said it more artfully than I just did, but I did not understand 0.75 to be, you can't have more than that. It was more that is what we are looking towards, but bare minimum, you have to have 0.5.
And Brooke, you have your hand up yet?
I just looked this up again in Robert's Rules of Order to make sure I was right about this. If Autumn would consent to a friendly amendment to my motion, since she already seconded it, based on the feedback people are saying, I would like the motion instead to be as follows. OPDS shall require a minimum of 0.5 staff per attorney FTE, comma, and fund up to 1.0 staff per attorney, depending on the size of the organization and the availability of OPDS funding.
I consent.
Cool.
And Autumn, oh, sorry. Autumn, did you already say you consent? Or
I did say I consent.
thank you. Any further discussion? Do we could hold a vote?
I move that we have a vote.
Yep. Let me get my list here. Bruce,
Aye.
Jack,
Aye. And I second the motion for the vote if it needed one.
thank you. It did. John Hamilton,
Aye.
John Sarr,
Aye.
Chris,
Aye.
Mark,
Aye.
and then Michelle's not here. Cott,
Aye.
Rebecca,
Aye.
Todd,
Aye, and thank you for the amendment.
and then Autumn
Aye.
and Brooke.
Aye.
All right. Well, we have a third item. Let me pull back over to that real quick. Wow, in the event we complete the staff to attorney ratio, I did not think we were going to get here. This is awesome. Great job. So now we would be looking to a supervisor to attorney ratio. There was a consensus by the group of a 1 to 10 ratio that would be proportional to the size of the entity. So if it were 5 attorneys, it would be 0.5. Two things to consider. How would this work for a consortium? And what is the minimum number of FTE that would require supervision? Any discussion?
I have a third thing that I think we need to consider is whether a supervisor of 0.5 means that you have a 0.5 caseload or you work half-time. And then also if you have a FTE of 1 for a supervisor for 10 attorneys, whether that person is expected to not have a caseload at all. I feel like the thing that's not captured here is that we had a pretty lengthy discussion about that we think that supervisors probably should have a caseload, I think was kind of the overall consensus because it keeps you in touch with the work and what's going on. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I think that that was one of the other issues brought up.
I did hear that as well. Thank you, Autumn. Yes. Let's see who I didn't see who raised their hand first, so I think Bruce probably spoke the longest time ago. So go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah, as to the caseload for supervisor, I think it's going to vary, wherever you are. But my sense of things is that most supervisors will get involved in a caseload somehow, whether people are out on maternity leave or family leave or sick. But mandating a specific caseload is often difficult, just depending on where we are in the contract cycle or any number of other things.
Okay. Cott, you had your hand up, and then yeah, that was it for now.
I think that the minimum or the minimum number of attorneys has to be 10, so that somebody's a minimum of a half-time supervisor. And it, there are issues with consortia. It may be that in a consortia you have to have full-time administrators or supervisors because of conflict issues. But certainly in a consortia, you probably need 2 supervisors, because you will, if they're half-time, they're going to hit conflicts and they can't supervise somebody that's a conflict.
Yeah, great points.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know if someone else wanted to speak. I had that same question is, do we have a definition of supervisor?
We do not.
Because if it is like checking the attorney's work and, dealing with clients and getting involved in cases, that's very different than just generally making sure that people are kind of more generically making sure people are doing a minimally adequate job. So.
Yeah, thank you, Autumn. In our best practices, there actually is, it goes into quite a bit of detail about what a supervisor does. Aaron may be able to speak to that a little bit.
I just moved into my kitchen. Yeah, our best practices do provide quite a bit of detail, and I think we could do something like just reference those best practices for someone who's doing direct supervision. The question would be whether or not that description works for supervisors working in consortia, just because of the relationship between the layers and the level of involvement you can have in those attorneys' cases.
I can certainly provide that in the relevant research. I'll provide that best practices document. It is available on our website too. John Sarr. Oh, you're on mute.
Kind of building on that is, I think you're also going to have a different, you're going to have a different kind of definition for not only a supervisor in a consortium model, but also across the state, because I've been part of consortias that were like 3 other people. And in those cases, we would have direct conflicts. So just like, has already been said, if the person you're supervising is representing a person who you can't represent because of a conflict, that gets very problematic. So I think it's going to be different in an urban area like Portland versus like Tillamook County. So, and it's, and it's very different to be, and I know because it's very different to be a supervisor at a public defender's office versus being the supervisor of a consortium. So there's, it's almost like apples and oranges.
Just a point of clarification, it could be that depending on the minimum that we sort of have a need for supervision, it could be that there is an attorney, and I've had conversations with attorneys that are like, I'm thinking of retiring or just not taking cases anymore, but there's a lot of new attorneys that are interested in doing this work and or are newly doing it and could really use some direction. And I would love to do that. I would love to be a supervisor, not taking cases anymore, but just supervising new attorneys coming in, that maybe mentoring, supervising, even training, that sort of a thing. So I think it could be something that, you could find somebody to do that outside of administration and practice potentially. I know that doesn't quite, there was some concern that said we or some value certainly associated with having someone with a caseload also supervising. So sort of actively practicing, but that is something that I've heard people that are on the other side of the practice, sort of ending their practice, really interested in supervising, training, mentoring. Scott, you had your hand up?
Sorry, again, I forgot to take it down. I apologize.
We are at 12:57, so I think a motion to postpone is certainly probably practical at this point. We have a lot of things to think about. I will send out the best practices document And I will also send out the 2 motions specifically. Todd, if you could send me that final one, I know it looked like you had typed it out, or was it Brooke? It was Brooke. Could you send that to me? Just email that to me, then I'll make sure that gets out to everybody when we'll send that out this afternoon. Elena will. Anything else for the good of I guess I made a motion. Is there a second? Maybe.
I will move if we need to, or second, that we adjourn for the day and postpone hearing, postpone further discussion on supervision.
Perfect. That was a motion. Any second?
I'll second.
All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time. Good work today.
Thank you.
All right.